The suitcase hit the floor before Ezekiel even realized he had let it go. He had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times at 30,000 feet. He would walk through the iron gates of the mansion he had built, find his mother in her garden chair, and watch her face break open with joy. He would kneel at her feet, the same feet that had walked barefoot to the market to sell groundnuts so he could pay his school fees, and he would say, "Mama, it's over. You will never carry anything heavy again." That was the plan. But the man standing in the doorway of a crumbling wooden shack, staring at a frail, grey-haired woman hunched over a bowl of rice in the dying afternoon light, that man had no words left. Welcome to today's story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also tell us in the comments where are you watching from. New York, London, maybe Jamaica or South Africa. Ezekiel Jonathan was not merely wealthy. He was the kind of rich that gets written about. The kind that owns buildings in cities he has never visited. At 32, he had built a business empire that stretched across 4 continents, earned a cover on African Forbes, and was once described by a journalist as the closest thing this generation has to a self-made king. And yet, the most important thing he ever built was the 3-bedroom mansion he constructed with his first real profit, on the same compound where he was born, with one instruction to every contractor: make it fit for a queen, because that is what she is. He was talking about his mother, Helen. He had left her there. He had left her there in that palace with a woman he believed loved her. He was wrong. Helen Jonathan had never once complained. Not when the well was 3 kilometers from their door and the clay pot on her head weighed more than her youngest child. Not when the rains failed and she worked 2 extra shifts at the market, selling tomatoes by the cup because a full basket was too expensive to risk. Not when the school wrote home to say Ezekiel's fees were 3 months overdue, and she walked to the headmaster's office herself, stood straight as a pillar, and negotiated an extension with the same quiet authority of a woman who had decided, long ago, that her son would not be stopped by anything as small as money. Ezekiel had watched all of it. He was 9 years old the morning he saw her slip off her sandal to check if the sole had worn through again, press it back on without a word, and keep walking. Something settled in his chest that day, not sadness exactly, but a kind of sacred anger, a promise forming without language. He made it out loud only once. He was 14, sitting on the step outside their 2-room house, watching his mother return from the market in the last light of evening. The pot was gone by then, they had graduated to plastic buckets, but her gait still carried the muscle memory of years of weight. She moved like someone who had learned to make her body into a foundation. He stood up and blocked her path. "Mama," he said, "one day I will build you a palace, with a gate, and a garden, and you will never carry anything heavier than a cup of tea for the rest of your life." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she laughed, not the dismissive laugh of someone humoring a child, but the full, warm laugh of a woman who recognized something real when she heard it. She cupped his face in both hands, still damp from the bucket she had just set down. "Then you better go study," she said, and went inside. He never forgot that laugh. It powered him through university on a scholarship he almost lost twice. It kept him awake in a Lagos office building at age 26, building his first business on a laptop, and 3 hours of sleep. It was in the room with him when he signed his first international contract, when he opened his second company, when he stood on a stage in Johannesburg and accepted an award from a man whose name he had once read in awe on the cover of a magazine. Every tower he raised, he was really building her palace. He had been so certain of that. Standing now in the shadow of a rotting doorframe, listening to the quiet scrape of a spoon against a ceramic bowl, Ezekiel understood, with the full weight of a man who had carried nothing for a very long time, that he had built the palace. He had simply forgotten to protect the queen. Rita walked into Ezekiel's life at precisely the right moment, which should have been the first warning. He was 31, newly minted on the cover of a business magazine, and deeply tired in the way that successful lonely men often are, full of achievement and empty of warmth. He met her at a charity gala in Abuja, the kind of event where everyone wore generosity like a costume. She was standing near a display of sponsored children's photographs, studying them with an expression so tender that the man beside Ezekiel leaned over and whispered, "Now that is a woman with a good heart." Ezekiel had thought the same thing. Rita was precise in her beauty, deliberate, polished, the kind of woman who understood that appearance was its own form of intelligence. But what disarmed him was not her looks. It was her questions. She asked about his mother before she asked about his business. She said, "A man who honors his mother is a man who understands loyalty," and looked at him as though she genuinely believed it. He was gone before the dessert course arrived. The courtship was careful and convincing. Rita sent Helen a wrapper fabric for her birthday, deep burgundy, Helen's favorite color, which meant Rita had asked around to find out. She called Helen Mama from the third visit onward, without being prompted, and Helen, who was not a woman easily softened, had smiled in a way Ezekiel had not seen her smile at a stranger before. "She has a settled spirit," Helen told him privately, "not like these restless girls." That was the closest thing to a blessing he needed. The wedding was modest by billionaire standards, which was Rita's suggestion. "Your mother worked hard for everything she has," she said. "I don't want her to feel like we are showing off in front of her." Ezekiel had held her face in his hands when she said that, moved beyond what he could articulate. He thought, "I have found the one." In those early months, Rita was everything. She cooked Sunday meals and sat beside Helen, learning the recipes with what looked like genuine devotion. She drove Helen to her medical appointments when Ezekiel was traveling. She took photographs, always photographs, of the two of them together, sending them to Ezekiel's phone with captions like "Your mama and I are just fine, go close your deal." He would look at those photographs in hotel rooms across the world and feel his chest loosen with relief. He was providing, he was loved, his mother was safe. What Ezekiel did not yet understand was that Rita was not a woman with a good heart. She was a woman with an exceptional memory, and she had been quietly, carefully, taking notes on exactly what a man like Ezekiel Jonathan needed to see. She had simply decided that seeing was enough. The opportunity came from Johannesburg, the way most life-changing things do, without warning and without apology. A consortium of investors wanted Ezekiel in the room. Not on a call, not represented by counsel, not briefed by proxy. In the room, they were building a logistics corridor that would stretch across 4 countries, and they had decided, after reviewing every candidate on the continent, that Ezekiel Jonathan was the only man whose vision was large enough and whose reputation was clean enough to anchor it. The contract was worth more money than his mother had ever dreamed existed in the world. He had 2 weeks to decide. He spent 3 days walking the mansion grounds thinking. The business case was simple. This was the kind of deal that transformed companies into institutions, but it would require him to be abroad for extended stretches. A year, perhaps 2, maybe longer if the expansion moved the way he expected it to. He sat with Helen on the veranda one evening, watching the sun dissolve behind the acacia trees at the edge of the property. "Go," she said before he had finished explaining. "Mama, I haven't even told you the full." "Ezekiel," she said his name the way she always had, 2 syllables carrying the full weight of a mother's authority. "You did not build all of this to sit on a veranda with an old woman. Go and finish what you started." He laughed despite himself. She always did that, turned his guilt into permission. That left Rita. He sat her down the night before his flight and walked her through everything. The household accounts, the staff salaries, Helen's medical schedule, her blood pressure medication on Tuesdays and Fridays, her eye clinic appointment in March. The specific brand of herbal tea she drank each morning that the nearby pharmacy stocked. He had written it all in a notebook, organized by month, and he placed it in Rita's hands like a man handing over something sacred. Rita received it with both hands and looked him directly in the eye. "She is my mother too," she said simply. He almost didn't leave, not because he doubted her, but because some quiet, animal part of him recognized that he was crossing a threshold he could not uncross. He stood at the departure gate with his boarding pass in his hand and called Helen one last time. "The garden gate sticks," Helen told him. "Tell that gateman to oil it." He smiled. "I love you, Mama." "I know," she said. "Go and make me proud." He boarded the planes. He sent money every month generously, without fail, wired directly into the household account Rita managed. He checked the balance occasionally, and it moved the way it should. He received photographs. He received voice notes. He believed every single one of them. Behind him, in the mansion he built with his mother's sacrifices as the foundation, a door was quietly closing. Rita waited until the flight tracker on her phone showed Ezekiel's plane over the Atlantic. Then she set the phone down on the marble counter, rolled her shoulders back, and looked around the mansion with the calm, unhurried gaze of a woman who had just inherited a problem and was deciding where to begin. She began with the photographs. There were 12 of them along the main corridor, framed images of Helen at various ages. Helen in her market clothes, young and strong, laughing at something off camera. Helen holding a newborn Ezekiel, her face luminous with exhaustion and love. Helen standing outside the old two-room house, squinting into the sun with the dignified posture of a woman who owned nothing and apologized for nothing. Rita unhooked them one by one, stacked them face down against the wall, and told the housekeeper to put them in storage. "Madam, those are..." "Storage," Rita repeated without raising her voice. The housekeeper went. That was Tuesday. By Friday, Helen's bedroom, the large, airy room on the ground floor that Ezekiel had specifically designed for his mother, with wide doorways for easy movement and windows facing the garden she loved, had been measured for a refit. Rita had a designer in from Lagos by the following week. She stood in the center of the room with a glass of wine and gestured at the walls while the designer took notes. "I need it to feel clean," Rita said. "Minimal, it should not feel lived in." It would become a walk-in wardrobe for her shoe collection within the month. Helen herself was handled gradually, the way Rita handled everything, not with a single dramatic blow, but with a slow, patient erosion. First, the ground floor room became unavailable due to renovations. Helen was moved upstairs, politely, with her things carried up by a staff member who kept his eyes low. Then the upstairs room became inconvenient, too close to the noise of the new social gatherings Rita was hosting. Helen was moved again, this time to the small staff quarters at the back of the property, presented as temporary. The staff watched all of this in silence, bound by the particular fear of people who need their salaries. The social gatherings multiplied. Rita filled the mansion with Abuja's glittering circle, politicians, influencers, the carefully curated crowd of people whose presence she used like currency. The house that Ezekiel had built as a home became a stage set. Every room was lit for other people's admiration. Helen moved through it all like a ghost in her own story, quieter each week, eating alone more often, her garden visits growing shorter as her energy and spirit slowly dimmed. She asked after Ezekiel constantly. Rita always had an answer ready. "He is in a very important meeting. He says he will call when he lands." He never landed. The calls came, but Rita had already decided what Ezekiel was allowed to hear. Helen was not a woman who asked for help easily. It had taken her 60 years of self-sufficiency to build that particular wall, and even now, with her body slowing and the familiar rooms of her son's house quietly disappearing around her, she resisted the idea that she needed rescuing. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself Rita was simply a young woman finding her footing, that the renovations would end, that the distance between them would close once the house settled into its new rhythms. But the rhythms never settled, they only widened. She tried Ezekiel's number on a Thursday afternoon in the third month, sitting on the narrow bed in the staff quarters with the phone Ezekiel had bought her pressed against her ear. It rang 4 times and transferred to voicemail. She left a message, careful, unhurried, the way she did everything. She did not mention Rita. She said only that she missed his voice and that the garden gate still stuck and that she hoped he was eating properly. He never called back. She did not know that Rita had seen the notification, listened to the voicemail in the kitchen with one hand braced on the counter, and deleted it with the same efficiency she applied to everything that threatened the version of reality she was constructing. Helen tried again the following week, and the week after that. Each time the calls dissolved into silence, she felt something in her chest grow smaller, not broken exactly but compressed, like a letter folded too many times. She decided to write. She had always trusted paper more than phones. She composed the letter over 2 evenings, sitting by the small window of her room with a pen Ezekiel had left behind. She wrote about small things mostly, the color of the jacaranda trees that month, a recipe she wanted to teach him, a dream she had where they were back in the old house and he was 14 again, blocking her path on the front step. At the bottom of the second page, almost as an afterthought, she wrote, "I am not sure Rita is well. Something in the house has changed. I pray I am wrong." She folded it into an envelope, wrote his business address in Johannesburg, the one on the letterhead of his last printed newsletter, and gave it to the junior houseman to post. Rita intercepted it at the gate. She read it standing in the driveway, her sunglasses on, one hand resting on the roof of her car. Then she put it in her handbag, drove to her hair appointment, and on the way home dropped it into a roadside bin without breaking her stride. That evening she sent Ezekiel a voice note, breezy and warm, with the sound of the television in the background. "Your mama is resting, baby. She had a big lunch and she's sleeping already. She's so happy, don't worry about anything here." Ezekiel sent back a single heart. Helen lay awake in the dark, listening to the party sounds drifting from the main house, waiting for a call that had already been stolen. The final move happened on a Wednesday, which felt wrong to Helen in a way she could not articulate. Wednesday was an ordinary day. What was done to her deserved at least the weight of a Monday. Rita had been building toward it for weeks, laying the groundwork with the patience of someone who understood that the most effective cruelties are the ones dressed in practicality. She began mentioning the renovations in casual conversation, a structural assessment, she said, commissioned by an engineer whose name Helen never heard twice. Load-bearing concerns, damp in the foundations, the kind of technical language designed to silence people who do not have the vocabulary to argue back. Helen listened and said nothing. She had learned by now that saying something only produced a smoother, more elaborate version of the same wall. The staff quarters were needed for the contractors, Rita explained. There would be workers coming and going at all hours. It would not be comfortable. It would not be safe, she added, with a concern so perfectly calibrated it almost sounded real, and wasn't it lucky, she continued, that there was the old structure at the edge of the property. Quiet, away from all the noise and dust, much better for someone who needed rest. She called it a cottage. It was a shack, wood and corrugated iron, and a door that did not close flush with its frame. Ezekiel had used it years ago for storing garden equipment before he upgraded to a proper outbuilding. The floor was swept, but the walls held the memory of disuse, a particular smell of abandonment that no amount of sweeping could remove. 2 staff members carried Helen's things across the property on a Wednesday morning, while Rita supervised from a distance, her phone in her hand. Helen walked behind them with her back straight and her face composed, because she was Helen Jonathan, and she had carried water on her head for 30 years, and she would not let this woman see her bend. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the shack and looked at her hands. Outside, through the single window, she could see the mansion, her son's mansion, the one he had described to her when he was 14 years old on a front step at dusk, his voice cracking with the weight of a promise too large for his young chest. She could see the lights coming on in the upper rooms as evening arrived. She could hear, faintly, the sound of Rita's music beginning. She thought about the letter she had written. She thought about the calls that rang out into nothing. She thought about a boy who once stood in her path and said, "I will build you a palace." He had built it, she could see it from her window. She simply was not inside it anymore. Helen reached for her bowl, ate her rice slowly and with dignity, and did not cry until the lights in the mansion went out and there was no one left to witness it. The decision to come home unannounced was not dramatic. It did not arrive with premonition or thunder. It arrived on a Tuesday evening in Johannesburg when Ezekiel was sitting alone in his hotel suite, eating reheated room service for the 4th consecutive night, and realized with sudden, startling clarity that he could not remember the last time he had heard his mother's voice directly. Not through Rita's reports, not in a forwarded voice note, not filtered through anyone's account of her well-being. Her actual voice, speaking to him, unmediated. He tried to calculate the months, he could not. He booked the flight that same night. He told no one, not his assistant, not his driver, and deliberately, with full intention, not Rita. He sat with that decision on the long flight home and examined it from every angle, trying to determine whether it was a husband's surprise or a man's suspicion. He was not yet ready to name what it was. He only knew that something in him needed to arrive before his arrival did. He landed in the early evening and hired a private car from the airport, bypassing the household driver who would have called ahead. When they reached the estate, he asked the driver to stop 200 meters before the gate. He paid, stepped out, and walked the rest of the way along the perimeter wall in the cooling dark, his suitcase rolling quietly on the tarmac behind him. He heard the mansion before he saw it. Music first, the kind Rita favored, loud and expensive sounding, the soundtrack of a party mid-momentum. Then light, flooding from every window on the ground floor, painting the lawn in long gold rectangles. He stopped at the side gate, the one that stuck, that he had never gotten around to fixing, and worked it open with the practiced pressure of a man who knew the particular resistance of his own property. He stood on the lawn and looked through the wide sitting room window. The room was full of people he did not recognize. Women in gowns that cost more than his mother's monthly medical bills. Men with the loud, performative laughter of people auditioning for each other's approval. And Rita, at the center of it, luminous and commanding, wearing a dress he had never seen, moving through her guests with the fluid ease of a woman entirely at home in her own kingdom. He stood very still. Then, because something made him turn, some instinct older than suspicion, something closer to love, he looked away from the mansion toward the far edge of the property. There was a light in the shack. Small and unsteady. A candle burning behind a single dark window, the way a lighthouse burns not to celebrate, but simply to say someone is still here. Ezekiel's suitcase stopped rolling. He did not look back at the mansion. He did not look at Rita through her glittering window. He walked toward the candle. The door did not have a knocker, so Ezekiel pressed his knuckles gently against the wood. There was a long pause, the sound of something being set down carefully. Then slow, deliberate footsteps, the footsteps of someone who had learned not to move quickly, either from age or from the particular exhaustion of a spirit worn thin. The door opened. Helen was smaller than he remembered. That was the first thing, not a thought exactly, more like a physical impact, the way cold water hits. He had last seen her 14 months ago, briefly during a 48-hour visit he had cut short for a conference call. She had seemed fine then, tired perhaps, but fine. The woman standing before him now in the candlelight was not fine. She was frail in the specific way that speaks not of illness alone, but of neglect, the kind of thinness that comes from meals eaten without appetite, from days spent without purpose, from being quietly, systematically forgotten. Her shawl was oversized and worn at the elbows. Her hair, always neatly kept in his memory, was roughly textured and uncombed. Her eyes, when they found his face, moved through several expressions in the space of a single second, confusion first, then disbelief, then something that broke him completely. Relief. She was relieved to see him, as though some part of her had stopped being sure that he was real. Ezekiel, his name in her mouth, just that. He could not speak. He looked past her into the shack, one room, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a small table beside the candle, and on the table a ceramic bowl with a spoon resting across the rim. Rice. A single fried egg halved, the meal of someone eating not for pleasure but for continuation. He looked at that bowl for a long time. Then he looked at his mother's hands, the same hands that had carried water, negotiated with headmasters, cupped his 14-year-old face and told him to go and study. They were thinner now, the knuckles more pronounced. The right hand trembled faintly, the way it had not trembled 14 months ago. His suitcase slipped from his fingers and hit the floor. "Mama," he said, and his voice arrived broken from somewhere beneath language. "What happened to you?" She lifted her chin in the way she always had, that reflexive, muscular dignity that no amount of hardship had ever managed to take from her. Her eyes were bright with tears she had decided, somewhere in the long months of this, that she would not shed in front of anyone. But she shed them now. Because it was him, because he had come. Because the boy who promised her a palace was standing in her doorway at last, and even if he had arrived too late to prevent everything, he had arrived, and that, to a woman who had spent months wondering if she had been erased from her own son's memory, was everything. Ezekiel stepped across the threshold, took his mother's frail body into his arms, and held her the way a man holds something he came terrifyingly close to losing forever. Outside, the party played on, indifferent and bright. Neither of them heard it. Ezekiel did not storm. That was the thing people would remember afterward, those who were in that room and spent years trying to describe what they witnessed. He did not raise his voice. He did not arrive with the theatrical fury of a man performing his anger for an audience. He simply opened the front door of his own mansion and walked in. He had his mother on his arm. He had found her a shawl, his own jacket, draped over her shoulders, because it was the warmest thing immediately available, and because something in him needed the gesture, needed her to feel covered and claimed and his. Helen walked beside him with her back straight, her chin level, her eyes forward. She had washed her face. She had combed her hair with the small comb from her bedside. She was determined, in the way only Helen Jonathan could be determined, to enter that room as herself. They crossed the threshold together. The music did not stop immediately. These things never happen with the clean timing of films. It took 4 or 5 seconds, a ripple of turned heads moving from the doorway toward the center of the room, a widening silence following behind it like a wake, before the music faded, and the room understood that something had fundamentally changed. Rita saw him from across the room. Ezekiel watched her face perform 3 expressions in rapid succession. The flash of shock, the scramble toward recovery, and then the smile, deployed like a weapon, warm and wide, as she moved toward him with her arms beginning to open. "Baby, you didn't tell me you were." "Don't." One word, quiet as a door closing. She stopped. Ezekiel looked around the room slowly. At the faces he didn't know, at the champagne glasses and the catered platters, and the flowers in vases taller than his mother. At the sitting room that bore no trace of the woman who had raised him. At the walls where 12 photographs used to hang and now hung, only curated art chosen by someone who wanted no evidence of where Ezekiel Jonathan actually came from. Then he looked back at Rita. "I built this house," he said, his voice carrying in the new silence with the ease of a man who had addressed boardrooms on 4 continents, "for my mother. I sent money home every month for my mother. I trusted you with my mother." He paused. "Where did you put her, Rita?" The room did not breathe. Rita's smile had dissolved completely. What remained underneath it was something small and cornered. Ezekiel turned to the assembled guests, Rita's carefully constructed world, her currency, her audience, and he told them. Calmly, completely, the shack, the bowl of rice, the intercepted calls, the letters that never arrived. The 14 months. He told them all of it, with his mother standing beside him and his jacket on her shoulders and his hand covering hers on his arm. When he finished, the room remained silent. Helen said nothing, she did not need to. She was already home. The renovations took 3 weeks. Real ones this time. Ezekiel oversaw every detail personally, the way he had overseen the original construction of the mansion years ago, walking the rooms each morning with a cup of tea, speaking directly with the workers, making decisions on site rather than by proxy. He restored Helen's ground floor bedroom first. He widened the doorways back to their original measurements. He returned her windows to face the garden. He found 11 of the 12 photographs in storage, had them cleaned and reframed, and rehung them along the main corridor in the same order they had always occupied, because order mattered and because memory deserved its proper place on a wall. The 12th photograph, the one of Helen outside the old 2-room house, he enlarged and hung above the fireplace in the main sitting room, where guests would see it first upon entering. He wanted them to know where this family came from. Helen moved back into her room on a Saturday morning, which felt exactly right. Ezekiel carried her bag himself. She stood in the doorway of her restored bedroom and looked at her garden through the window for a long time without speaking. Then she turned and looked at her son, and in the economy of expression that had always existed between them, the private language of a mother and the child she had shaped, everything that needed saying passed between them without a single word. She patted his cheek, he covered her hand with his. That was enough. Rita was gone by then, quietly, efficiently, with the assistance of the family's legal team and the kind of settlement agreement that buys permanent silence. Ezekiel did not discuss her. He found that he had very little anger left once his mother was restored to her rightful place. Anger requires a future tense, and he had decided to spend his future tense elsewhere. He incorporated the foundation on a Thursday, the Helen Jonathan Foundation for Elder Care, named without asking her permission, because some decisions do not require permission, only love. Its mandate was straightforward, to identify elderly men and women living in neglect or isolation across the country, and to ensure they received housing support, medical care, and the one thing no amount of money could manufacture but could absolutely protect: dignity. Helen attended the launch ceremony in the garden of the mansion, seated in a chair placed deliberately at the center of the gathering, because Ezekiel had given specific instructions to the event coordinator. My mother sits at the center, not the background, the center. She wore the burgundy wrapper Rita had once bought as performance. Helen wore it as reclamation. Ezekiel stood at the podium and looked at his mother before he looked at the crowd. Everything I have ever built, he said, I built because one woman believed it was possible before I did. This foundation is not charity, it is a debt, and it is long overdue. Helen looked at her hands in her lap. She did not cry this time. She simply smiled, full and warm, the way she had smiled at a 14-year-old boy on a front step at dusk, when he blocked her path and made her a promise that turned out, despite everything, to be true. The garden gate had been oiled. It opened easily now in both directions, welcoming everyone in and letting nothing precious slip away again.